We are now going to move into our first presentation with a very important person. The title of his presentation is called Craft and Conscience. Our presenter is Dr. David Sokol. He is a professor emeritus of art history at UIC and taught at several other colleges before joining the faculty at UIC in 1971, teaching courses in American art, museology, and a team-taught course on historic preservation. He chaired the department for 17 years and spent 1 year chairing both the art history department and concurrently the Department of Performing Arts. Dr. Sokol has been a visiting faculty member at several colleges throughout the country. In addition to serving as the first curator of the Terra Museum of American Art and as interim director of both the Terra and Spertus museums, he has curated exhibitions throughout the country and in Germany and authored a master plan for public art for Michigan City, Indiana. More recently, he curated traveling exhibitions on the Illinois landscape artist Harold Greger and one on Leon and Sadie Garland of Hull-House, and he really is our go-to person for the Garlands. He was the series editor for Cambridge Monographs on American Artists, the co-author of American Art, and has written numerous catalogs and many reviews in scholarly journals. Other books include Otto Newman, His Life and Work, The Noble Room, a monograph on Wright's Unity Temple, and Oak Park, The Evolution of a Village. Professional service includes the presidency of the American Cultural Association, chairing the Professional Practices Committee of the CAA, and a just completed second term chairing the CAA's committee selecting the best art book of the year. Dr. Sokol has served a term as an elected member of the Oak Park Village Board and the Library Board, several terms on Oak Park's Historic Preservation Commission, and as a chairman of the Public Art Commission. So he's not only a brilliant scholar, he's also very involved in community engagement in his area. Please join me in welcoming David Sokol.
I usually don't need a mic. I'm sure you can hear me. It's interesting that I didn't mention music. Benny Goodman got his start here at Hull-House too. So we've got to remember music was not ignored. So let me sort of get into it. I'm going to try and sort of do two things simultaneously and juggle a narrative of the development of things going, ways art was being dealt with from the beginning of Hull-House to essentially World War II, when there was some continuity after that. But soon after Jane Addams' death, and then with the onset of the war and the end of the public art programs, things sort of slowed down, and many of the artists who were associated with Hull-House, either exhibitors, teachers, or whatever, left to go on to other places, and I just don't have the time to go into their subsequent careers. And at the same time, I'm going to try and concentrate on the Garlands as much as I can within this framework. So here's again the Hull-House complex. Here's a portrait of Jane Addams by Alice Kellogg Tyler, 1892. She was an important figure, although very briefly, because she died very young. She did this portrait of Jane Addams, and she did this portrait of Mary Rose Smith, and was one of the first instructors at the Art Institute School when it was a brand new place. She and John Vanderpool actually were both teachers of some of the early students, like Ivan Albright's father, who was a student there before he went on to be a general artist. So she was an important figure, but she died young, but she was definitely tied in as a successful artist, as well as being one of the very many affluent women who helped support Hull-House in various ways. Here's another view of Ellen Gage Starr, just to make sure we don't ignore her, although I am going to ignore her for the rest of this talk. She'll be getting her due in other ways. Leon Garland, and I'm just mentioning he died in 1941 because he died fairly young. He was born in 1896, and he died at 45. his wife, Sadie, outlived him by 56 years. Butler Gallery, which we've already just seen, so I'll go by that quickly. There were two things, though, at the Butler Gallery. It was a place where it was showing contemporary art and earlier art. There were, copies or prints of famous paintings. It was a dual way of enculturation and acculturation to bring people attention to the great art of the past as well as the art that is being made in the present. Here's a couple of pieces by Leon Garland that are a little out of chronological order because, again, it shows the development of the whole Hull-House complex. This is a watercolor, as you can see, that was done somewhere in 36 to 37. Leon was born in Russia, came here as a young man, got very involved in trying to make a living with his family, but was brought in by Morris Topshevsky, who we'll be looking at a little bit later, as a place to get involved. And Leon was one of the people who was doing a lot of art. Although we think of him as painting, now he was teaching batik and all kinds of other more craft-oriented things, if you want to make that distinction. And Ella Benedict was the first full-time instructor. Again, someone who taught both at the Art Institute and here, and for at least a period of time lived here. She was not an avant-garde artist. She was not particularly interested in what was happening here and now, but she was very open to letting the students who were so interested, find their way in that way. Or you could see her work, in this case a portrait of a neighborhood young woman. It is quite traditional, tinged with impressionism. Now, why is he here, you might ask? Frank Lloyd Wright gave a major lecture here in 1901 called The Art and Craft of the Machine. We're not here to talk about that, or his interest in combining craft and the machine, which did not have a major role in the development of the arts and all that. But it was significant that this is where he gave that lecture, and there was, a definite awareness and a relationship of his world and what was happening at Hull-House. I realize I'm barreling through this very quickly, but this is an overview. Frances Glessner, another name that you may associate with architecture, Glessner House, of course. She, as an adult, came here to study metalsmithing. The History Museum, Chicago History Museum, once had a major exhibition years ago that Sharon Darling put on that included a lot of her metal work, and of course Glessner House has some of it as well. So somewhere around 1904, 5, 6, there were women here, primarily, working at learning metalsmithing from a point of view of high art, certainly of high value pieces. Emily Edwards is someone who is one of the teachers here at two different points. She came here as a comparatively young woman, born and raised in San Antonio, where she ended up, by the way, being the developer, the major force behind the Riverwalk in San Antonio after she left Hull-House the second time. Sort of, I think, a little known fact that's sort of very interesting. She's shown here teaching a ceramic class where she was a fairly young artist herself. Her own art, and I'm sorry if this is about the worst image I have, was clearly not cutting edge, avant-garde. She came from a very traditional kind of background at that time, and we really identify with her much more as a teacher than as an artist herself. William Jacobs, one of the early students here from the 20s, was very, very involved in the neighborhood and part of the Jewish community that lived in and around Maxwell Street, and he also had a girlfriend named Sadie Ellis. And he was squiring her around, and they were getting fairly serious, but then he went to go to Paris. And he asked Leon, his friend, to sort of watch over her. Don't jump ahead on this thing, but he was very... But he fell in love with someone else in Paris, which freed Leon to pursue her. And they got married. Here's a painting, a charcoal and chalk piece of Sadie Garland by Jacobs. A lot of the work by Leon and Sadie Garland is still in the possession of Eva Dreikurs, Sadie's stepdaughter, Dreikurs' own daughter, because they were both widowed when they married. And she has tons of it, and most of the work that, and other relatives I borrowed from around the country for that exhibition, and I bluntly would still like to do a major exhibition like that here, where it deserves to be at USC. There were all kinds of arts being taught there. There's reference to the pottery. Here's some vases from the kilns, about 1927, and also from the late 20s. Now we saw a photograph of this historian. Well, here's a portrait of him by Sadie Ellis Garland in 1930, when she came back from France herself. Did a portrait of his wife as well. Mexican weaving, Mexican women weaving. One of the big issues, I think, that has not been grappled with sufficiently yet is how much these crafts of different kinds of crafts by different people from different ethnicities, backgrounds, were a good attempt to keep pride and history alive in them, and to what extent was a progressive area whitewash to put people in their place. There's nothing that says Mexicans are better potters than Italians or Jews who are from the neighborhood. But they were sort of stereotyped and cast into these roles. And I think we need to do a lot more work about what that's all about. But here's Mexican woman weaving. Sorry for the size of that. Emo Armin was another person in the neighborhood who taught here, actually, very briefly. He was one of the people who started going back and forth to Mexico and to the Southwest, to Albuquerque and Taos and so forth. And he was getting to be more of a modernist, you can see. He was being influenced by an awareness of much more contemporary French art by 1930. His earlier work was much more impressionist. Okay, Leon and Sadie Garland got married, 27, and they asked that people not give them any gifts, but give them money, because they wanted to go to France to study art. They were living here. Jane Addams, who we tend to think of as a somewhat forbidding figure in many ways, went around and scrounged up all she could find in the way of furniture for their apartment in the Hull-House complex. She had been here as a student, brought in by a friend, and had taken courses with Leon. And they're just in some of the biographies written by relatives and friends, very fascinating little stories about how Jane Addams, again, we go to come, you don't need that, do they? The Garlands have no furniture, you know, so she was very helpful. So they went to France with an open return ticket, and they went to study with Leger. And here's this painting by Leon, obviously very cubistically oriented, but also very whimsical and humorous. They did not enjoy working with Leger. They did not find him to be simpatico at all, or very, interested in nurturing them. And they went off to work with a gentleman named LaHote, who I'd never heard of before, but who really did nurture them. One of Sadie's early portraits of that period, called The Well-Dressed Man, a lot of the figures that they did, but particularly she did, were people from the streets in a very much way that the Ashcan artists had done that, earlier on in the United States. They could be, washerwomen to junk peddlers to prostitutes to whomever came along. So here was a man clearly of a brown complexion, but we don't know anything really about him. But she got involved in a more cubistic style, Cézanne-ish influence kind of work. And again, not here to give a full analysis of that development as an artist that way. They went on these trips with this LaHote to the south of France and other places around France in the summer to do, again, painting. And this is the kind of work she was doing there, as well as a still life that is either was in France or possibly closer to 1930 when she returned here. Before I go back to that. So they were in France a year and a half or so, and then they went to Romania because they wanted to look into family history, and then Germany. The Depression, of course, was starting. They did not have a lot of money. They tried to do some things in Germany, but there was hostility to them by especially Leon's, obviously being Eastern European Jewish. But he did do some interesting things that he learned about technology, and I don't include it in here, but there's actually, he has some things about the truck works that he did his industrial design later on. This is one of the works here that obviously we've all seen, the Hull-House courtyard of 1931. And I think what's very interesting is to compare his work that we will see, that we're seeing here with, and the ones we'll look at in a few minutes, by Tomaszewski, because they're both dealing with the unemployment of the Depression. But this is, men standing around, looking at the newspaper, obviously looking for the want ads and jobs and so forth, having a drink of water, dressed decently. It does not show any depth of depression in the sense of personal loss and so forth. One of the extra buildings and the only far away building in the early years, was at the building by Halliburton Route on Michigan Avenue. This Diana Court was a small space within that building, which Hull-House used to have other exhibitions and to sell work that came out of Hull-House. Leon and Sadie Garland had the first exhibition there when that opened up. And so he was being, received and having success very early on. One of his often reproduced paintings, one that's over at Spertus, The Wedding in the Cemetery. I wrote pages on this. I can't spend time talking about it here, but it recalls small town life, in the Jewish diaspora of Eastern Europe. A Wedding in the Cemetery, which was meant to have produced good luck. And it was just all kinds of interesting things like gravestones dividing, the disadvantage from the wedding party and so forth. Well worth a good look at some point. Jacobs starts doing different kind of art after when the Depression hits, and he does doing things with the city rather than his more impressionistic work. Sadie, there were so many portraits of Sadie by all kinds of different artists. They all liked her, and someone comes over about her high cheekbones and so forth. People interested in her. Here's a portrait by Wallace Kirkland from 1934, a photograph in the possession still of family. And Kirkland was, of course, a photographer who lived and worked here, and became extremely well known as a Life magazine photographer, not that much later. And I did want to just show you, just in case you don't know, it's probably preaching to the choir here quite a bit, but if you didn't know the name otherwise, you'd recognize that. He did two very, very famous portraits of Gandhi. One just walking down a road, and this one. And he, I don't know if we have some of his stuff here, but the University of Wisconsin has most of his archive. But he was in and around that same world, and obviously did that photograph of Sadie, not of Leon, Sadie. Now, he made a print of one of his earlier paintings in 1934. He did printmaking. He did, again, batik, he did all kinds of fabric kinds of work as well, and taught classes from kids to adults in this. Leon had his first heart attack while they were in Europe. I think it was in Germany, I don't remember exactly. As I say, he had several more. He had another one in the mid-30s, and which really weakened him. In the last X years of his life, he didn't do that much more art. Now, he couldn't teach that many classes. Sadie did not have the security of feeling herself to be as good an artist as him. Whether she was or not, we're not making a judgment. She felt she also had to honor him, and she ended up getting more and more involved in administrative activities on Hull-House. And Jane Addams learned to rely on her a great deal in various aspects, not just the social work aspect, administratively in other ways as well. Back to Leon for a minute. The tailors, he does do a lot more in the 30s of this kind of thing that looked towards the urban poor and so forth, but again, not necessarily the depths of poverty. A woodcut by William Jacobs that's part of a series of works that I just don't have time to get into now, but and a number of the artists in and around Hull-House did works that reflected both the poverty and the social issues of the Depression in the United States, but also the larger world of what was happening in the move towards World War I, the Holocaust, and so forth. Erin Bora, who is also another artist here, and there's a painting of the area as well, but here one of his woodcuts from '37, shown from that same series, the West Side, and here you see a man with his face looking a little grim, carrying a load on his back. And here's one of his paintings of that period as well. Now, Tupshevsky, as I said, was an important figure here too, and lived here for a while, and then he moved into the Abraham Lincoln Center when that was built, but he still had an ongoing role and relationship with Hull-House and with many of the other artists here. This was a much more general genre scene, not dripping with any particular sadness or pathos, although then this kind was. So we get prints, and there was a painting of this guy, The Relief Station, which of course tells you a lot by just its very title. And Unemployed, where he not only the faces, but the exaggerated, length, the more expressionistic style is evocative of trying to show the relationship between the poverty and with this man just sitting there like that, and this one, the depth of his sadness. Although he also did works like this that are not as grim. The Century of Progress, where it shows the working men who were, I guess, lucky enough to have jobs working there. And he also, by the way, died young and did not have careers really beyond the Depression and World War II, as the same as with Leon Garland. Leon got onto working in the Depression and the public art programs, and he did a series of four nice paintings. He did more, but there are 4 still owned by the Park District of Chicago, and they've been restored and they hang at the administrative headquarters now. I first came across those in the 1980s when I and a few graduate students were hired to do a study of the art in the Park District field houses. And there was a lot of it there, the art that the directors of the field houses didn't feel they should take home with them when they retired, which many of them did, and they thought that they had personal art. So God knows how much of that disappeared. But these are showing genre. And again, you can see the difference. His work is of the people. It's obviously in the heart of the Depression, on a WPA, but it does not show abject poverty and things like that. Sadie. They did get away occasionally to go up to Wisconsin and to spend a couple of days on vacation, and she did do paintings like this, Barbara at Gill Rock, 1934. She did both oils and watercolors, and they're still fairly structural, if you will, but they have essentially gone away from the more cubistic kind of work that she'd been doing while she was in France. We saw this already today. But again, it's important. There were a lot of posters. Not only are we seeing this because it tells us about Hull-House community worship, but a lot of posters were being created here. And the Chicago History Museum has a fair supply of those. There's one great one that's telling about venereal disease, showing this thing like this. I was young and I found that interesting. WPA posters, again, were being produced here. It was opportunities for people to earn money, and hopefully when they were selling those as well. Edward Millman was another artist here, probably through the later 30s. And this flop house is sort of an iconic piece for surveys of art of that period. And the flop house, obviously, they're getting just, in a room, guy takes his shoes off, mattress on the floor. The one figure's just napping, the other one his sadness and his lot and his life is quite evident. This one by Mitchell Saporin, 1938, a well-known work. Back of the Yards, the old neighborhood of Back of the Yards, and a very, if you will, foreign-looking, immigrant-looking couple. This done in 1938 with a hint towards one of our other speakers. Saporin left and became the first professor of art at Brandeis, and he turned himself, instead of being the son of a union organizer, into a New England gentleman somehow. But this is, again, one of his best-known paintings of the Chicago one particularly. He did a lot of major murals before he left, including these ones at Lane Tech, which have been beautifully restored and can be seen, I guess you have to sign up for tours these days. And I just thought it was interesting, these two artists who were part of the Hull-House world ended up getting the largest WPA commission, the largest Treasury Department commission, and therefore the highest fee of any artist, I think, in the whole 30s, for these huge murals in the St. Louis Post Office. It was Saporin and Millman, these two Chicago and Hull-House identified artists who got this, and this is obviously just a detail thereof. Charles White got a start here. We've seen a lot of Charles White in recent months at this Art Institute, and mostly his work after he left Chicago, and unfortunately in the exhibition. But Hull-House was also a place for not only the Jewish community nearby, the Italian community nearby, and the Irish community nearby, but it was one of the first places where African-American artists got a real chance, Archibald Motley aside. Archibald Motley was somewhat of an anomaly at the School of the Art Institute subsequently, but there were several African-American artists who really got a chance to exhibit and sell their works for the first time at Hull-House. So here's a work. So I'm really showing sort of the end of the period that's under discussion, but that's the work we have access to. Harvest Talk, I'm sorry, that's just an illustration I pulled out. And of course, this is one of his most famous works that was done, again, after the period, and just about the time he was leaving Chicago for California. And James Seabury had a very brief period here as well. But he didn't live here, but he did exhibit here. Also, there was an opportunity for the modernists, and there's the last few images, are the artists who were the modernists, who were not involved in that social justice world. And I should say that, and I'm going to sort of keep an eye on the time, when Emily Edwards came back in the 30s, she'd been in Mexico. Now, Jane Addams was interested in what was going on in Mexico as well. She was aware of the administrative aspects of trying to encourage social justice. an awareness of the Indian heritage and all of that. But specifically, Emily Edwards went and studied with Diego Rivera. And so when she came back here to teach, and I have a quote in here somewhere, I just don't remember where it is, but they attracted her back by giving her a higher salary than any of the other teacher heads of departments, music, theater, or anything. And there's this wonderful letter saying, don't tell anybody how much you're earning. But, and I'm sure it wasn't large by today's standards in any way, but they so much recognized the importance, I almost have to say the centrality of the visual arts among the various arts, not to in any way denigrate, what was happening in theater and music and so forth, but there was such a large presence for the visual arts, broadly, again, construed, craft, and so forth. And so the social justice side of it is the part, what I think of as the conscience part of it, as that predominated. But in the 30s, still modernists were having a chance to show it. Like Julio de Diego, who was one of the artists in the show the last few months ago at the Arts Club. And he was doing essentially surrealist art. Mystical figure things that might remind you of De Chirico in the terms of the geometry of the buildings and so forth. But then he, like so many of the others, left. Charles White left. Millman left. Bowrod left. He went to New York, where he achieved sort of immortality by marrying Gypsy Rose Lee. And there are worse fates, I'm sure. He really, his artistic reputation sort of declined, but he did a lot of stuff for the Artist Equity Organization by doing posters for them and getting his wife to entertain there. So he did a lot for the arts. Also, Rudolph Weisenborn in Chicago, much more abstractionist artist, 1935. He was exhibiting here as well. And I have one more by him. There are others, but this is just to give you some, again, survey of the kinds of people going on. Any one of these. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to end with Leon Garland, the blacksmith of 1940. He had a flurry of activity in 40-41 before he died. Morgan Street. I have one more. Oh, that's it. Before I ask you questions. When he died, again, Sadie, who had already had been interim director of Hull-House for a very brief period of time. They had both been on the board in the last years of Jane Addams' life. When he got so ill after another heart attack, and again, that's when she really got into social work. Jane Addams was writing letters in support of her abilities, even though she had no degrees and no education in these things. And so, essentially, when she remarried, and she married Dreikurs, who they were friends. I mean, they were both friends with Dreikurs, and I wish I could find where I have this little quote. But they were very friendly, but Dreikurs went to one day to criticize something about what Leon was doing. He said, Dr. Dreikurs, I don't tell you how to run your business, don't tell me how to run mine. It was very nice. But they were good friends. And so when Leon died, Sadie essentially, except for a few drawings, never did really her own art again. And as you say, she found it to be a testament to Leon and a way of honoring his work for the 56 years that she outlived him. She really didn't do any art. They did set up a little foundation, and I donated some time ago these prints that produce a thing of 10 of his most important paintings as prints, and it didn't last very long, the foundation, and there was no money, to do this. And Leon Garland, when he died, the Art Institute had set up this new room to show, Chicago Art, he was the first person they showed. They gave a one-person show to. So, and there's a lot more, and again, I wish I could go on a lot more about him, but they were both very important, very interesting, had tremendous influence that we have yet to plumb the depth of. So now we go back to, thank you for attention. I'll try and answer any questions.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I am here, I think, because I know so little, which is why I'm so thrilled and interested in this process. I'll be introducing the speakers, I think, all at once. Their bios are actually in the program. But in the interest of time, rather than having me constantly come up here, Annie Storr, I've known for probably 12 years or so, since we overlapped while she was the chair of education studies at the Corcoran College of Art and Design in Washington, D.C. She's currently a visiting scholar at Brandeis. Rima Luden-Schultz I've known for probably 24 years, 23 years, something like that, as an independent scholar and public historian and a former assistant director of the Jane Addams Hull-House Museum here at UIC, and the author of numerous important articles and collaborator on a forthcoming book. She is the author of the introduction to a new edition of Hull-House Maps and Papers, and co-editor of Wood and Build in Chicago, 1790 to 1990. And Regine Gloria is a multidisciplinary artist and bookbinder from Chicago's Albany Park neighborhood, whose studio fosters an open approach to sharing work with new audiences and encourages collaboration and integration. I want to say that this is a subject that's very near and dear to me as the daughter of Dick Higgins, who had a small press that was very community-based in New York City in the 1960s and 70s. I thought maybe I would begin or launch or at least offer an observation from this fantastic book on book arts on page 20 here. I'm going to quote Joan Lyons, who's a really interesting person to think about in terms of artist books. And I think her terms are extremely interesting for us today. Perhaps the hardest thing to do in connection with the artist's book is to find the right language for discussing it. Most of our criticism of art, and I say this humbly as an art historian, is based on the concept of a work of separable meaning, content, and style. This is what it says, and here is how it says what it says. But the language of normative criticism is not geared toward the discussion of an experience, which is the main focus of most artist books. I'm going to leave you with that thought.